Hey all, this is Travis. Just doing another little installment here on the Les Paul project here. I'm just going to go into a little bit more depth about cutting the nut. I don't have the stuff. I'm not actually going to be cutting the nut itself in this video, but I want to talk a little bit about the role that the nut plays on the guitar, and why ensuring that the nut is correct is so it's not even just important, it's vital to the guitar functioning correctly. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about things that the nut can address and the things that it can't address. Maybe not misinformation per se, but just sort of misapplied knowledge, that sort of thing. There are a lot of issues that people have with their guitars that can be solved by correctly cutting the nut. So hopefully this will give people a few ideas about some things. But first off, if you're looking at the nut on your guitar, if you're looking at replacing it, if you're looking at cutting a new nut for it, maybe trying to fix something on the nut, before you get too far into it, you just need to sit down and really think about what the nut does. I think a lot of people, get the idea in their head, well, maybe I need to replace this with a graphite nut. Maybe I need to, do this other type of nut. I need an actual bone nut. I need, this, that, or the other thing, without thinking about really what the nut does rather than just sort of what it looks like and roughly what it does. And once you start thinking about things based on their actual function rather than just what they look like or even what their function looks like, you can get a better idea. You can sort of apprehend, like you can wrap your mind around what it means to be working with them and maybe what you need there. So first off, the main functions of the nut. First one is to set the string height. You don't want the nut cut too high unless you're playing slide. You may want the string height high for slide, at which point, you're going to have a high nut. Like, a lot of dobros are set up with a high nut. That's fine if that's what you're going for. If you're playing the guitar in a traditional fretted way, you're probably going to want the nut to be closer in height, the bottom of your nut slots to be similar in height to where the crowns of your frets are. Maybe just a very, very slight amount higher, but not much higher. If your nut is cut too high, your guitar is going to play with, just basically it's going to play harder all the way up and down the neck. The nut is every bit as essential as the bridge in establishing the height of your strings. So if your nut is cut too high, it doesn't really matter what you do on the bridge, you're going to have a hard playing guitar, and that's obviously not what you want. The second one is to provide a bearing edge for correct intonation on the guitar. So this is probably one of the main causes for tuning issues that are related to the nut, is that it's cut in such a way that the bearing edge isn't on the very front lip of the nut. Now obviously you can get buzz feet and intonation corrected nuts. I don't have that on any of my guitars. I guess I've put them on guitars before, but you can buy those compensated nuts, and that's all fine. The main thing I look at when I'm doing the nut on my guitar is to make sure that the bearing edge is the very edge of the nut where the string breaks over, right? This is what establishes sort of the end point of that end of the string. So you want that to be in exactly the right spot. If it's not in the exact right spot, your intonation is going to suffer. So that's, an incredibly important thing for your guitar as far as your open strings playing. So setting the string height, establishing a bearing edge. Third one, string spacing, making sure the strings are an appropriate distance apart from one another. If you don't have good string spacing, your guitar is going to play weird. It's going to, not be optimal. And then the fourth one is guiding the string to the tuners. So the nut is the first thing to determine the path of the string, right? So we're just going to take a look at this guy here. Okay, so string's coming along here. It goes to the nut. The nut determines the path to the tuners, right? Because there's that break point there, which we will address in a moment. So those are the things that that the nut accomplishes, or at least attempts to accomplish. Now, if you have a poorly cut nut, it will have difficulties accomplishing those things for you, and you'll need to remedy it. if we're going to be talking about a nut and we're going to be talking about a Les Paul, I want to address a pretty common thing that gets brought up about Les Pauls, and that one, I'd never really heard a ton about this with regard to tuning until probably the last 5 years or so. But there's stuff out on the internet now about how the Les Paul headstock design creates bad tuning. Basically, your G strings and possibly D, but generally the G string will go flat, or just go out of tune when you bend strings because of this, because the tuner is out here and the nut is here. I'll just hold that in closer there. So you can see there's this angle here, and so then the belief is that because of that angle, it's a bad design, and that causes the guitar to go out of tune. And I think that's at best it's kind of dumb to even say that, and here's why. If that's the case, now if we're going to be making this statement, we're going to say that the design itself is wrong. Okay, so the problem is caused because the Gibson Les Paul has a 17-degree head angle, which is too steep, and then the tuners are too far apart, and it causes all these angle problems. Then no Les Paul should ever stay in tune. None of them. No Les Paul with a 17-degree head angle and with the tuners arrayed like that should ever stay in tune. Ever. Because if we're saying that's the problem, that would be the result of the problem. Right? And then if that's the problem, then certainly no Dean guitar would ever stay in tune. Like, they are always out of tune, right? They would have to be out of tune constantly, all the time, and impossible to ever keep in tune without having some sort of a contrivance on there. And I see people, putting those on Les Pauls too. And I don't think it's necessary, because I don't believe that the headstock design is inherently unstable for tuning, because I've played and owned Les Pauls and stayed in tune just fine. Well, how did I manage that? Because the nut was cut correctly. If your guitar isn't staying in tune, it's not because of some mistake someone made 60 plus years ago that most people just live with. It's probably because the nut was incorrectly cut. And there are people who will argue this, and they're wrong. And the proof of them being wrong is Les Pauls that don't go out of tune. There you go. It's not that hard of a thing to prove. So if you're Les Paul, that's not saying that some guitars don't have problems. Plenty of guitars have problems staying in tune. It's just that if you're going to solve a problem, you got to find out what the problem is. Otherwise, you're just stacking stuff up to try and address the problem. I'll use the example here. So string Butler basically is a set of rollers that sits in like this, that causes a straight string pull through the slots in the nut, right? Okay, so let's say that it isn't binding on that axis. Let's say it's binding this way, right? Because that can be a thing. That can be a thing. It may not be binding because of a lateral thing. It could be binding because of a vertical thing. That's not going to address that. If the nut slot is cut wrong, for example, if the nut slot is misshapen, it's not going to address that. It's only going to address things that would have to do with a nut slot that doesn't accommodate the actual angle that the string goes. And you can say, well, you shouldn't have to cut the nut that way. Well, yeah, you should. There's nothing about a nut that inherently means that the slots have to be at perfect 90 degrees to the face of the nut. The purpose of the nut isn't to have 90-degree angles between the face of it and the slot. The purpose of the nut is to correctly place the strings on the face of the nut and to guide them to the tuner, right? That's the purpose of the nut, not to have a 90-degree thing. No one cares. It doesn't matter if it's 90 degrees. What matters is that it serves its function, right? You following me here? Just because you get a pre-cut nut that's at 90 degrees has nothing to do with how nuts should be. It has to do with how manufacturing works. It has to do with people doing what they think is going to be the most useful for the most number of people. Now, you can tailor a nut with a slot that's the perfect 90 degrees, but you just basically need to feather the slot wider on the back side of it. Another thing that typically causes these problems is nuts that are cut too narrow. This is another dumb thing that I've read on the internet, is about someone coming up with the idea that the nut slot needs to be the diameter roughly of the string that's sitting in there. So if you're running 10s on your guitar, then your high E nut slot needs to be 10/1000ths of an inch wide. Let's think about this for a second. 10/1000ths of an inch. So if you have a 10% margin of error, that's 1/10,000th of an inch error, right? Now, I'm not going to break out the feeler gauges here, but let's take a look here at the old vernier calipers. We'll break out some science here for you people. Man, it is hard to get. Come on. There we go. Right in front of the camera. That is the thickness of the high E string, right, on this white Les Paul. If we scroll it back in here. All right. Oh. There we go. And there's 11/1000ths. That's a 10% variance. 10%. That means that if this is your string, 1/10 of that is off, so then it's about so much too big, at which point your super tight tolerance is destroyed. And I'm going to say this, if you're cutting nut slots with hand files, I don't care how gauged they are. You are not steady enough. No one is steady enough for 1/10,000th of an inch variance through the whole slot. You aren't. You're not going to be that tight. So if people are trying to actually accomplish this and keep things to such a tight tolerance to the strings that are going to be in there, no wonder people are going to be binding up in there, because your nut slots are way too narrow. And I don't understand where people think that they're getting a big benefit from this. So let's say, okay, right? So let's say that this is the nut slot. We got a big old microscope, right? Or a microscope, right? We have a rounded bottom, perfectly matches the string, and here's the string itself, right? Okay, string sits in here like this, right? Because we can't have this, because then that's apparently terrible, right? Your tone's just going to go down the crapper. Until, of course, you play a fretted note, at which point it's this, right? It makes no sense. And all it does really is give you a lot of reasons to wind up with nut slots that are cut absolutely too narrow so that the string binds in there. Now you can cut nut slots too wide, but it has to be significantly wide before the string is going to start rolling around in there. Trust me. So if you have 10s and you cut 13/1000ths on your high E, it is not the end of the world. Because I guarantee, for one thing, that slot probably isn't perfectly straight the whole way through. And the other thing is, I mean, it probably does a little bit of this. Even if you're doing it with a gauged slotting file that's set at 10/1000ths. So, once again, I think it's people marketing to ignorance more than anything else. So what do you want then? How wide should your nut slots be? They should be wide enough so that the string seats in there decently and doesn't roll. But even with that, you don't want it super, super tight, because once again, those things bind in there. The other thing is the way the slots are shaped. I'll break this guy back out here. Okay, so they can catch in there because, of course, the string is going that way. Now you can angle that slot ever so slightly towards the tuner. Well, like I was saying, this doesn't have to be 90 degrees. The other thing is you can open the back side of the slot so that the string, rather than breaking over a hard corner to make that turn over to the tuner, can actually break over a soft corner, which once again gives less opportunity for things to get hung up. It doesn't make your tone worse. It doesn't make your nut less durable. It doesn't make anything worse. All it does is make it so that your strings are less likely to get hung up in the nut slots. And then really, the other thing after it comes down to cutting the nut slots is just making sure that the nut is, of a decent material and that it is lubricated if it needs any lubrication. So, a little bit of graphite goes a long way. There's people talk about other things too. I honestly don't have that many problems with them. So if you're sitting here thinking, well, straight pull is better, whatever else, just remember what causes strings to go out of tune once they've been in tune, and that is unequal tension along the length of the string, right? So, okay, I'm playing along, right? I bend a note, it pulls everything up because I increased the tension on the string. String catches in the nut, right? So what was once there is now in the nut, right? So the string actually got shorter behind the nut, so there's more tension behind the nut, less tension here. It's no longer equal, so this string is flat, right? I mean, that's the basic stuff that we're talking about here. If you've ever played around with doing dive bombs on a stock Strat, you've encountered the other where it goes sharp. Same sort of thing, because you have unequal tension, and then you have a catch point where it keeps that tension unequal. It's not allowed to equalize. So you need to, give the string a little bit of a tug to get everything to equalize. So what does this come down to? So ultimately, this comes down to make sure that the nut on your guitar is cut correctly if you're worried about tuning. If you're having tuning problems, have the nut looked at. That's really one of the first things that you got to go for is the nut. People have bought a lot of sets of tuners. People have bought a lot of different contraptions, like a string Butler thing and that sort of thing, or even home remedies like installing string trees, which are ironically the bane of the existence of so many Strat players. But I've seen it where people have done that on Les Pauls, and it's really not necessary. You can work around that with just cutting the nut correctly. So, and what I'm saying with the nut really applies to pretty much any other thing, not just on your guitar, but on your guitar rig, or really any technical thing that you're dealing with. Think about what the thing does and how it accomplishes it. If you can break that down, then you can fix the nut on your guitar. You can rebuild the drum brakes on your car, because apparently you have a very old car, or rebuild the disc brakes on your car, I guess. Or there's all sorts of things that you can do, but you just need to break things down to what their functional elements are and how they accomplish it. And then once you do that, you can start to think about ways, okay, if you understand how these things work, you can understand how they work together. And once you understand how they work together, you can take some action on them, instead of just buying and trying, which can be fun to do and might get you where you want to go, but you're not really approaching things from a standpoint of knowledge. So that's my rant for today. If you're still with me, thanks for staying on here. Next time, hopefully I'll get those nut files soon so I can practice what I preach and actually get the nut cut for this thing and get it all strung up and see how she sounds. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.